Eleanor Jackson's story began like any other ordinary day in her life, with the sun shining brightly over New Orleans. 7 months into her pregnancy, she had ventured to the local grocery store to stock up on essentials, her heart filled with the joyful anticipation of welcoming her first child. Eleanor was known for her quiet strength and kindness, a beloved member of her close-knit community. The atmosphere of the day shifted abruptly as Eleanor walked through the parking lot, balancing a bag of groceries against her swollen belly. A police cruiser sped into the lot and stopped with a screech, startling her. The door slammed open, and Officer Bradley Cole emerged. Middle-aged and stocky, his reputation as a tyrannical enforcer preceded him. His demeanor exuded arrogance and malice, traits well known and feared in the neighborhood. "Stay right there," Cole barked, his hand resting ominously on the gun strapped to his hip. Eleanor froze, confusion and fear coursing through her. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, her voice trembling as she clutched her bag. "You're loitering," Cole sneered, his words dripped with contempt as he scanned her from head to toe. "People like you don't belong here." Eleanor's stomach churned, but she kept her composure. "I'm just heading home," she said softly, pointing toward her car. Her calm response only seemed to fuel his anger. "Don't talk back to me," he roared. The intensity of his gaze made Eleanor's heartbeat quicken. She glanced around for help, but onlookers averted their eyes, avoiding involvement. When Eleanor attempted to take a step back, Cole lunged forward. In a cruel and unprovoked act, he kicked her in the stomach. Pain seared through her body as she collapsed to the ground, instinctively clutching her belly. Her scream shattered the silence, echoing across the parking lot. Groceries spilled from her bag, apples rolling aimlessly as the world seemed to freeze in horror. People began to gather, pulling out their phones to document the brutality. A woman shouted, "She's pregnant," but Cole remained unmoved. His defiance was evident in his glare, as though daring anyone to challenge him. Eleanor lay curled on the asphalt, tears streaming down her face as she whispered a desperate plea for her unborn child's safety. The sound of ambulance sirens pierced the air moments later, signaling help was on the way. Still, the damage had been done. At the hospital, Ethan Jackson arrived breathless, his heart pounding as he rushed to his wife's side. Eleanor lay on the bed, her face pale and her breaths shallow. Her hand rested protectively on her belly. "Eleanor," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He took her hand, his fingers trembling. She opened her eyes weakly and looked at him, tears escaping as she choked out, He kicked me." Ethan clenched his jaw, fury bubbling beneath the surface. He was no stranger to adversity. A former U.S. Special Forces officer, Ethan had seen the darkest sides of humanity during his service. But this was personal. The sight of his wife, battered and broken, ignited a fire in him unlike anything he'd ever known. He kissed her hand gently. "I won't let this go," he vowed. "You and our baby deserve justice." Ethan wasted no time. The next morning, he began his mission to hold Officer Cole accountable. Reaching out to former military colleagues, many of whom had transitioned into legal and advocacy roles, he pieced together a plan. The video footage of the assault had already gone viral, sparking outrage across social media. Ethan knew this momentum was their greatest weapon. He compiled evidence of Cole's misconduct, complaints that had been swept under the rug, testimonies from other victims, and records of the department's systemic failures. Every piece painted a damning picture of a man who had wielded power as a weapon of oppression. Meanwhile, Eleanor's recovery was slow but steady. She found strength in the growing movement outside her hospital window. Support poured in from neighbors and strangers alike. People delivered meals, sent messages of encouragement, and held candlelight vigils. The words "Justice for Eleanor" became a rallying cry, uniting the community. Ethan's relentless efforts culminated in a press conference held in a historic square downtown. Flanked by civil rights activists, journalists, and lawyers, he stood tall, his presence commanding attention. "Thank you for being here," Ethan began, his voice steady but impassioned. "What happened to my wife was not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a system that has failed to protect its citizens. But we won't stay silent." He presented the evidence with precision, outlining a pattern of abuse that could no longer be ignored. The crowd erupted in applause and chants of support, their collective energy a testament to the power of unity. In the days that followed, protests swept through the city. The mural of Eleanor in downtown New Orleans became a beacon of hope, a reminder that their fight was far from over. Public officials were forced to take action as pressure mounted. Officer Cole was suspended and later arrested, facing charges of assault and misconduct. Ethan's determination did not waver. He worked tirelessly with his team to push for broader reforms within the police department. The fight extended beyond one man. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed such abuses to persist. Eleanor, now recovering at home, watched the news with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. Her husband's bravery had sparked a movement, one that ensured her child would grow up in a world striving toward justice and equality. Months later, as Eleanor cradled her newborn daughter, she whispered, "You are loved, and you are safe." Ethan, standing beside them, smiled. "We fought for you," he said softly. "And we'll keep fighting. For you, for your mother, and for everyone who deserves to live without fear." Their story became a symbol of hope, proof that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, love, unity, and determination could pave the way for change. It reminded the world that silence is complicity and that standing together, people have the power to demand justice and build a brighter future. The awakening of a community. The events surrounding Eleanor Jackson's attacks sent shockwaves not only through her neighborhood, but across the entire city of New Orleans. As she recovered in the hospital, the ripple effects of the incident grew stronger with each passing hour. What had started as an act of brutality now had the potential to spark systemic change, if the community could harness the collective outrage into action. Ethan Jackson, who had spent years navigating hostile territories as a Special Forces soldier, understood the need for strategy. The battle for justice wasn't going to be won with just one press conference or a series of viral videos. It required persistence, allies, and above all, a plan that would ensure long-term accountability. Building the alliance. Ethan reached out to community leaders, activists, and professionals who shared his passion for justice. He knew this wasn't just about Officer Cole. It was about dismantling the culture of impunity within the police force. Among those who stepped forward was Rebecca Morales, a fiery civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases of police misconduct. Rebecca's involvement brought credibility and legal weight to the fight. "We're not just going to hold Officer Cole accountable," she told Ethan during one of their late-night strategy meetings. "We're going to expose every layer of the system that enabled him." Ethan also connected with local journalists who were determined to shed light on the institutional failures that had allowed officers like Cole to thrive. Among them was Marcus Green, an investigative reporter known for his in-depth exposes. Together, they began piecing together a timeline of Cole's misconduct, uncovering a trail of ignored complaints, suppressed evidence, and complicit superiors. The rising movement. Meanwhile, the community rallied around the Jackson family. Vigils, marches, and town hall meetings became regular occurrences. Churches opened their doors for discussions on racial inequality and police reform. Schools hosted workshops to educate students about their rights. Social media campaigns amplified the message, with hashtags like #JusticeForEleanor and #EndPolicedBrutality trending nationwide. Artists contributed murals and posters depicting Eleanor as a symbol of resilience. Musicians wrote songs about her bravery, and poets performed spoken-word pieces about injustice and hope. The movement was no longer just about one woman. It had become a cry for systemic change. Eleanor, from her hospital bed, watched the news reports and scrolled through the messages of support on her phone. She was overwhelmed by the love pouring in from strangers. "This isn't just about me," she told Ethan one evening. It's about every person who's been silenced. We have to make sure this doesn't happen again. The reckoning for Officer Cole. The evidence against Officer Cole was irrefutable. Witness statements, video footage, and a history of complaints painted a clear picture of a man who had abused his power with impunity for years. Under mounting pressure, the district attorney's office announced that Cole would face charges of aggravated assault, abuse of authority, and misconduct. For Cole, the walls were closing in. He was suspended without pay pending trial, and his name became synonymous with corruption and abuse. Yet Ethan knew this was just the beginning. "We need to make sure this doesn't end with one man," he told Rebecca. "The whole system needs to be held accountable." Rebecca agreed. "We'll file a civil suit against the department. It's time for them to answer for their failures." A city on edge. As Cole's trial began, the city of New Orleans found itself at a crossroads. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs that read "Justice for Eleanor" and "No more immunity." The media swarmed the proceedings, ensuring that every detail was broadcast to the nation. Ethan testified with a calm but commanding presence, recounting the impact of Cole's actions on his family. Rebecca presented a meticulous case, highlighting not just the assault, but the broader pattern of misconduct within the police force. The defense, desperate to shift blame, attempted to paint Eleanor as a potential threat, but the tactic backfired spectacularly. Public outrage surged as the community rallied even harder behind the Jacksons. "You won't silence us," a protester declared during a live news interview. "We're here for Eleanor, and we're not going anywhere." The verdict and beyond. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty. Officer Cole was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a rare outcome in cases involving police brutality. The courtroom erupted in applause, and outside, the streets were filled with cheers and tears of joy. But for Ethan and Eleanor, the fight wasn't over. The civil suit against the department moved forward, and Ethan continued working with activists to push for broader reforms. They advocated for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight committees, and better training for officers. Their efforts began to yield results as city officials introduced new policies aimed at addressing systemic issues within the police force. A legacy of change. Months later, as Eleanor cradled her newborn daughter, Hope, she reflected on how much had changed. "She'll grow up in a better world," Eleanor said softly, looking into her baby's eyes. "Because we didn't give up." Ethan smiled, his hand resting gently on hers. "We fought for her, for you, and for everyone who deserves justice, and we'll keep fighting." The Jackson story became a symbol of resilience, inspiring communities across the nation to stand up against injustice. It reminded the world that change is possible when people come together with courage and determination. In the end, Eleanor's tragedy had sparked a movement that transformed pain into progress and fear into hope. Her strength, Ethan's unwavering resolve, and the unity of their community proved that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a legacy of change, ensuring that their voices, and those of countless others, would never be silenced again. The ripple effect of justice, the conviction of Officer Bradley Cole, and the sweeping changes that followed marked a turning point for New Orleans. Yet the battle for justice did not end in the courtroom. The movement sparked by Eleanor Jackson's ordeal continued to grow, fueled by the realization that systemic reform required not just legal victories but a cultural shift. Eleanor and Ethan's story resonated far beyond their city, igniting a nationwide conversation about police accountability, racial justice, and community resilience. Their fight became a blueprint for others seeking to dismantle oppressive systems and rebuild them with fairness and humanity. A new chapter for the Jackson family. Months after the trial, Eleanor had recovered physically, though the emotional scars of that day lingered. She and Ethan had welcomed their daughter, Hope, into the world, a symbol of renewal and strength. The name was not just a choice but a declaration: hope for a future free of fear, where their daughter could grow up knowing her worth and her rights. Eleanor began sharing her story publicly, not out of bitterness, but as a means of empowerment. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," she said during a televised interview. "But what we choose to do after, that's what defines us." Her speeches drew crowds, and her words became a rallying cry for change. Eleanor's calm yet impassioned demeanor inspired others to share their own experiences. Mothers spoke about losing their sons to police violence. Young people shared stories of being profiled and harassed. What had begun as one family's fight for justice had evolved into a national reckoning, transforming pain into progress. Ethan, too, found himself in a new role. His military background and strategic mindset made him a natural leader in the movement for reform. He worked closely with activists, lawmakers, and community leaders to push for systemic changes. His ability to bridge the gap between grassroots efforts and institutional change was instrumental in maintaining momentum. One of Ethan's first initiatives was to establish the Jackson Foundation for Justice and Reform, aimed at providing resources for victims of police brutality and their families. The foundation offered legal support, mental health services, and advocacy training. It also partnered with organizations across the country to promote police reform legislation. "We don't just want to react to injustice," Ethan said at the foundation's launch event. "We want to prevent it. We want to educate, empower, and create a system that serves everyone fairly." The foundation's reach expanded rapidly, and its impact was immediate. Families who had once felt powerless found a network of support and a platform to seek accountability. The foundation's work began to shift the narrative, proving that change was possible through collective action. The national movement for justice. Eleanor's story inspired similar movements in cities across the United States. Protests demanding justice for victims of police violence erupted in major metropolitan areas and small towns alike. The hashtags #JusticeForEleanor and #HopeForJustice became rallying points for a new generation of activists. In Congress, lawmakers debated police reform bills that included mandatory body cameras, independent review boards, and de-escalation training. Some states began implementing sweeping changes, while others faced pressure from their constituents to follow suit. Eleanor and Ethan traveled to speak at rallies, testify before legislative committees, and meet with community leaders. Their advocacy was relentless, but they remained grounded in their mission. "This isn't about vengeance," Eleanor often said. "It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." Challenges and backlash. Despite the progress, the movement faced significant resistance. Critics accused activists of vilifying law enforcement, and some police unions pushed back against reform efforts. The Jackson family received threats, but they refused to be silenced. Eleanor and Ethan stood firm, emphasizing that their goal was not to dismantle law enforcement, but to rebuild it in a way that served and protected all communities equally. "Accountability isn't anti-police," Ethan explained during a panel discussion. "It's about ensuring that the badge represents integrity, not oppression." The backlash only strengthened their resolve. They knew that meaningful change was never easy, and they remained committed to the fight. Community healing and unity. As the movement gained traction, the Jacksons focused on fostering healing within their own community. They organized town halls, bringing residents and law enforcement together to discuss issues and rebuild trust. These meetings were tense at first, but over time, they became a space for honest dialogue and collaboration. One officer, inspired by Eleanor's story, approached her after a meeting. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "And I want to be part of the change." Moments like these reminded Eleanor and Ethan that change wasn't just about policies, it was about hearts and minds. A legacy of hope. 2 years after the incident that had nearly taken everything from them, Eleanor and Ethan stood before a crowd in Washington, D.C., addressing thousands gathered for a national rally on police reform. Hope, now a toddler, sat in Eleanor's arms, her wide eyes taking in the sea of people. Eleanor spoke first, her voice steady and strong. 2 years ago, I was a victim. Today, I am a survivor, a mother and an advocate, and I am here to tell you that we can build a better future together. Ethan followed, his words a call to action. We owe it to our children to keep fighting, to keep pushing, to keep believing that change is possible. This is our moment, and we won't let it pass. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing across the National Mall. In that moment, the Jackson family's journey came full circle. What had begun as a tragedy had transformed into a powerful movement for justice and equality. The future. The Jacksons' work continued to inspire others, their story a reminder that ordinary people could create extraordinary change. Eleanor often said, "Hope isn't just my daughter's name. It's the promise of what we can achieve when we stand together." As the sun set on their rally in Washington, Eleanor and Ethan looked out at the crowd, their hearts full. They had faced unimaginable pain, but they had also found purpose. Their fight was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. And so, with hope in their arms and hope in their hearts, the Jackson family moved forward, knowing they had already made the world a better place, and believing they could make it better still. Building bridges, healing wounds. 2 years had passed since the assault that changed the lives of Eleanor and Ethan Jackson forever. Though their fight for justice had sparked a national movement, the couple knew that the real work was just beginning. The system that had allowed Officer Bradley Cole to thrive was larger than any one individual, and dismantling it required not just confrontation but collaboration, healing, and sustained action. Eleanor and Ethan had grown into prominent figures, not because they sought fame, but because they embodied the hope and resilience that people desperately needed. Their journey had shifted from fighting personal battles to spearheading systemic change, and the lessons they had learned guided every step of their mission. Expanding the vision. Eleanor's recovery had been both physical and emotional. Her body had healed, but the trauma of that day lingered in unexpected ways. Flinching at loud sounds, mistrusting strangers in uniform, and wrestling with the anxiety that her daughter, Hope, might one day face similar injustices. Yet Eleanor was determined not to let fear define her life. "I refuse to let what happened to me harden my heart," she said during an interview with a national news network. "If we close ourselves off, we lose the ability to connect, to grow, and to heal. And healing is what we need most." Inspired by this philosophy, Eleanor launched the Bridge Initiative, a nonprofit organization aimed at fostering dialogue and trust between communities and law enforcement. Its goal was to create spaces for honest conversations, empathy-building workshops, and collaborative solutions. One of the first events hosted by the Bridge Initiative was a community summit titled Healing and Hope, held in the very parking lot where Eleanor had been attacked. The summit brought together families, activists, and police officers, many of whom had initially been wary of each other. At the heart of the event was Eleanor herself, sharing her story with an openness that disarmed even the most skeptical participants. "Pain divides us," she said, addressing the crowd. "But it can also unite us if we're willing to listen and learn. Today, we're not just talking about what's broken. We're building a foundation for something better." Bridging divides. The summit was a turning point, not just for the Jackson family, but for the entire city of New Orleans. Police officers who had long been defensive about calls for reform began to engage with the community in new ways. The initiative introduced de-escalation training programs, co-designed by community members and officers. These sessions emphasized empathy, communication, and cultural competence. Ethan played a critical role in these efforts. Drawing from his military experience, he developed workshops that focused on teamwork and accountability. In the field, trust is everything, he explained to a room of officers during one session. If you can't trust the person beside you, you fail. The same goes for the communities you serve. Without trust, we all fail. These programs began to yield tangible results. Reports of excessive force incidents in New Orleans dropped significantly, and the city became a model for community policing nationwide. Officers who had once resisted change found themselves embracing it, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. National impact. The Jackson family's work extended far beyond New Orleans. The Jackson Foundation for Justice and Reform continued to grow, partnering with universities, nonprofits, and government agencies to develop policies that prioritized accountability and fairness. States began adopting independent review boards for police misconduct cases, a key reform the foundation had championed. Eleanor and Ethan also became fixtures on the national stage, testifying before Congress and advising policymakers. Their insights, grounded in both personal experience and extensive research, carried weight. Eleanor's calm but impassioned voice became a rallying cry for reform, while Ethan's strategic expertise lent credibility to their proposals. But they never lost sight of their roots. Every decision they made, every speech they delivered, was informed by the people who had stood with them from the beginning. The neighbors who had organized vigils, the activists who had marched, the witnesses who had spoken out, personal sacrifices. Despite their public successes, the fight for justice took a toll on the Jacksons. Media scrutiny, threats from extremists, and the relentless demands of their work left little time for rest. Yet they found solace in each other and in their daughter, Hope, who had become the light of their lives. "We're doing this for her," Ethan often said, watching Hope toddle across their living room. "For her and for every child who deserves a future free of fear." Eleanor, too, drew strength from her family. Late at night, when the weight of the world felt unbearable, she would sit by Hope's crib and whisper promises into the darkness. "You'll never have to wonder if you're safe. We'll make sure of it." A legacy of hope. 3 years after the incident, the Jacksons hosted a national conference on justice reform. Held in Washington, D.C., it brought together leaders from all walks of life: activists, lawmakers, educators, and law enforcement officials. The theme was simple but powerful: unity through action. The conference culminated in a keynote address by Eleanor. Standing on the stage, she looked out at the thousands gathered, her voice steady and clear. 3 years ago, my life was forever changed by an act of brutality, she began. But what came after was even more powerful. It was the outpouring of love, support, and determination from people who refused to accept the status quo. It was the realization that when we come together, we can achieve what once seemed impossible. Ethan joined her on stage, holding Hope in his arms. "This isn't the end of the story," he said. "It's just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. But if we keep fighting, keep believing, and keep working together, there's nothing we can't accomplish." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the hall and beyond. The road ahead. The Jackson family's journey was far from over. The road to justice and equality remained long and uncertain, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But Eleanor and Ethan were undeterred. They had seen firsthand the power of resilience, unity, and hope. Their work continued to inspire millions, reminding the world that even in the face of unimaginable pain, progress was possible. And as they looked to the future, they knew they were building something far greater than themselves, a legacy of justice, compassion, and change that would endure for generations. In the end, the Jacksons had proven one undeniable truth: even the darkest moments can spark the brightest movements, and even the smallest acts of courage can transform the world. The movement matures. 5 years had passed since the fateful day that forever altered Eleanor and Ethan Jackson's lives. What began as a deeply personal fight for justice had evolved into a nationwide movement. The Jacksons had become symbols of resilience and hope, but they were also pragmatic about the work that remained. Movements often lost steam over time, and maintaining momentum required not just passion but strategy, adaptability, and a willingness to confront new challenges. Eleanor and Ethan had learned this lesson well. Their journey had matured, and so had their mission. They were no longer reacting to injustice. They were proactively building a foundation for a better future. A new generation of leaders. One of the Jacksons' earliest realizations was that true change required a broad and diverse coalition. While they had been at the forefront of the movement, they understood that the next phase depended on empowering others to take the lead. Through the Bridge Initiative and the Jackson Foundation for Justice and Reform, they began cultivating young leaders from marginalized communities. They partnered with schools, community centers, and universities to offer mentorship programs, leadership training, and scholarships. The programs focused not just on activism, but also on education, entrepreneurship, and civic engagement. We need to prepare the next generation to lead, not just protests, but policies, businesses, and entire communities. Eleanor explained during a leadership summit, "Change doesn't happen in silos. It happens when we weave justice into every aspect of our society." The results were transformative. Young people who had grown up witnessing the injustices their parents faced now had the tools and confidence to fight for a better future. Some became activists, others lawyers, journalists, or policymakers. Many of them credited the Jacksons for inspiring their journey, confronting systemic barriers. As the movement expanded, so did the scope of its mission. Eleanor and Ethan recognized that policing was only one piece of the puzzle. Economic inequality, educational disparities, housing discrimination, and healthcare inequities were all interconnected, and addressing one required addressing them all. The Jacksons collaborated with economists, educators, and public health experts to launch a series of initiatives targeting systemic barriers. These included economic empowerment hubs, programs that provided job training, small business grants, and financial literacy workshops in underserved communities. Education for equality, a partnership with local schools to introduce anti-bias education and curricula focused on social justice and civic responsibility. Healthy Futures Program, clinics that offered affordable health care and mental health services, recognizing that trauma often stemmed from both personal and systemic injustices. These programs didn't just address immediate needs, they planted seeds for long-term transformation. If we want a fair society, we need to invest in the people who've been left behind, Ethan said during a televised interview. It's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better. Global influence. The impact of the Jacksons' work extended far beyond the United States. Their story and initiatives became a source of inspiration for movements around the world. In South Africa, activists adapted their model to address police brutality and economic inequality. In Brazil, favelas adopted the Jackson Foundation's community-led policing strategies. In Europe, advocacy groups invited Eleanor and Ethan to speak about their experiences and offer guidance on addressing systemic racism. The Jacksons themselves were humbled by the global reach of their efforts. "We never imagined this would go beyond our own neighborhood," Eleanor admitted during a speech at the United Nations. "But it shows that injustice knows no borders, and neither does hope." Personal growth amidst the fight. While their public lives were consumed by their work, Eleanor and Ethan remained deeply committed to their family. Hope, now 5 years old, had grown into a curious and empathetic child. She often accompanied her parents to events, her presence a reminder of what they were fighting for. Eleanor found joy in balancing motherhood with her advocacy. "Hope keeps me grounded," she often said. "She reminds me that this fight isn't just about policies or systems. It's about people, about families, about the world we're leaving for our children." Ethan, too, had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated. Once a man of action, he had developed a profound appreciation for the power of storytelling, empathy, and collaboration. His military past had taught him to rely on strategy and discipline, but his journey with Eleanor had shown him the importance of vulnerability and connection. Their marriage, forged in the crucible of hardship, had only deepened over the years. They were each other's greatest allies, sounding boards, and sources of strength. The power of legacy. By the movement's 5th anniversary, the Jackson Foundation hosted its largest event to date, The Justice Summit, held in New Orleans. Thousands attended, including activists, policymakers, educators, and community leaders from around the world. The summit featured workshops, panels, and keynote addresses, all focused on sustaining and expanding the fight for justice. A highlight of the summit was a special dedication ceremony. The city unveiled a statue of Eleanor in the very parking lot where she had been attacked. The statue depicted her standing tall, cradling her pregnant belly, with an expression of quiet strength. As Eleanor stood before the crowd, her voice wavered with emotion. "This statue isn't about me," she said. "It's about all of us, about the strength we find in each other, the courage to stand up, and the belief that we can change the world." Ethan, standing beside her, added, "This movement isn't just a response to what happened. It's a declaration of what's possible. And it's a promise to keep fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes." Looking forward, the Jackson story was far from over. They knew the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, but they also knew they were no longer running alone. The movement they had started had become a force of its own, carried forward by people from all walks of life who shared their vision of a better world. Eleanor and Ethan remained at the heart of it all, guiding, inspiring, and reminding everyone that even in the face of unimaginable pain, there was always hope. And as they tucked hope into bed each night, they whispered the same promise. "You'll grow up in a world where justice isn't a dream, it's a reality. And we'll make sure of it." With that, the Jacksons continued their journey, knowing they had already changed the world, and believing they could change it even more. Sustaining the fire. 10 years had passed since the attack on Eleanor Jackson, a moment of cruelty that had ignited a movement and transformed lives. The fight for justice and equality had evolved from protests in the streets to policies in government halls. Yet the Jacksons knew that movements, like fires, required constant tending. Without vigilance, the flames of progress could flicker and fade. Eleanor and Ethan now stood as elder statespeople of the movement, guiding it through its most challenging phase, ensuring that its gains were not only preserved but expanded. They had learned that justice was not an endpoint, but a continuous journey, and they were determined to sustain the fire they had lit. The weight of legacy. The Jacksons' names had become synonymous with resilience and reform. Schools taught their story as part of civics lessons. Documentaries chronicled their journey. Books and films celebrated their courage. While the recognition was humbling, it also brought immense responsibility. Eleanor often reflected on what it meant to carry such a legacy. "This isn't just our story anymore," she told Ethan one evening. "It belongs to everyone who has joined this fight. We have to keep moving forward, not for ourselves, but for them." Their daughter, Hope, now 10, was keenly aware of the weight her family carried. Though her childhood was filled with love and support, she grew up with an acute sense of the world's inequities. "Why do people hurt each other, Mama?" she asked one day after seeing a news report about a violent protest. Eleanor knelt beside her, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, but that's why we do what we do, to help people see each other as human beings, not enemies." Hope nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "When I grow up, I want to help too." Ethan smiled, pulling her into a hug. "You already are, sweetheart, just by being who you are." Institutionalizing change. One of the Jacksons' greatest challenges was ensuring that the reforms they had fought for would outlast them. Movements often faltered when leaders stepped away, and the Jacksons were determined to avoid that fate. They began focusing on building institutions that could carry the torch of justice forward. The Jackson Center for Justice and Equity, a state-of-the-art facility in New Orleans that served as a hub for research, education, and advocacy. The center hosted seminars, developed curricula for schools, and trained leaders from around the world in community organizing and policy reform. Community Justice Fellowship Program, a nationwide initiative that provided funding and mentorship to young activists. educators, and entrepreneurs working to address systemic injustices. The program emphasized innovation, encouraging fellows to create new solutions to old problems. The People's Accountability Network, PN, a grassroots coalition that monitored the implementation of police reforms and advocated for transparency in law enforcement. PAN leveraged technology to track data on police misconduct and worked with communities to ensure their voices were heard. These institutions became cornerstones of the movement, providing structure and stability while allowing for flexibility and growth. Healing through storytelling. Over the years, Eleanor had become an advocate for storytelling as a tool for healing. "We can't move forward if we don't acknowledge where we've been," she often said. She began hosting community storytelling events, where people shared their experiences of injustice, resilience, and hope. One such event, titled Stories of Strength, drew thousands of participants from across the country. The event featured everyone from survivors of police violence to former officers who had turned into reform advocates. Each story was a testament to the complexity of the human experience and the power of transformation. Eleanor herself shared her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor and leader. "What happened to me was devastating," she told the audience, "but it also awakened something in me, a belief that we could be better, do better, and that belief has carried me ever since." The impact was profound. Attendees described the event as life-changing, and many went on to become active participants in the movement. Facing new challenges. As the years passed, new challenges emerged. The rise of misinformation and polarization threatened to erode the progress the movement had made. Social media, once a powerful tool for organizing and advocacy, had become a double-edged sword, amplifying division and spreading false narratives. Ethan, with his military background, approached these challenges like a battlefield strategist. He worked with technology experts to create platforms that promoted accurate information and facilitated constructive dialogue. "We can't let the truth get drowned out," he said during a panel discussion. "This is a battle for hearts and minds, and we have to fight it with integrity." Eleanor, meanwhile, focused on building bridges. She reached out to groups that had previously opposed the movement, engaging them in conversations about shared values and goals. While progress was slow, her efforts demonstrated that even the deepest divides could be bridged with patience and empathy. Passing the torch. By the movement's 10th anniversary, Eleanor and Ethan had begun to step back from their roles as frontline leaders. They knew it was time for a new generation to take the reins. "Movements aren't about one person or one family," Eleanor said during a farewell address at the Jackson Center. "They're about all of us working together to create a better world." Hope, now a teenager, stood by her parents' side, her presence a symbol of continuity and renewal. She had inherited their passion for justice and was already emerging as a leader in her own right, organizing youth-led initiatives and speaking at events. "You've taught me that courage isn't just about standing up. It's about standing together," she said during a speech at a youth rally. "And I promise to keep standing, for as long as it takes." A movement eternal. Eleanor and Ethan retired to a quieter life, though they remained active as advisors and mentors. Their home became a gathering place for activists and leaders seeking guidance, their wisdom a priceless resource for those continuing the fight. As they sat on their porch one evening, watching the sun set over New Orleans, Eleanor turned to Ethan with a smile. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. Ethan took her hand, his eyes filled with pride. "We've done what we could. And now, it's up to them." The fire they had kindled burned brightly in communities across the nation and beyond, carried by the countless lives they had touched. The Jackson story had become a legacy, proving that even in the face of unimaginable pain, love, resilience, and determination could transform the world. And so, as the stars appeared overhead, Eleanor and Ethan rested, knowing that their fight had not been in vain, and that the fire of justice would burn for generations to come. A legacy of justice and unity. As the years unfolded, The story of Eleanor and Ethan Jackson became more than just a narrative of tragedy and triumph. It became a beacon of hope and a powerful lesson for humanity. The movement they started had outgrown its beginnings, embedding itself into the fabric of society and inspiring millions to confront injustice wherever it appeared. The Jacksons, now living quieter lives, remained steadfast in their belief that true change came not from a single event or person, but from the collective actions of people united by a shared vision. Their journey, filled with pain, resilience, and ultimate redemption, taught the world lessons that echoed far beyond their immediate fight. The lessons of their legacy. The power of resilience. Eleanor's story showed that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit could endure and rise. Her ability to transform her pain into a force for good reminded everyone that resilience is not about denying hardship, but about choosing to grow through it. Unity is strength. Ethan's leadership demonstrated the power of unity in the face of adversity. He showed that change could only happen when people from all walks of life, activists, community members, policymakers, and even those within broken systems, worked together toward a common goal. Justice is a journey, not a destination. The Jacksons understood that justice was not something achieved overnight. It required persistence, accountability, and a willingness to adapt. Their fight was not about quick fixes, but about building systems that could endure and serve future generations. Hope transcends pain. The birth of their daughter, Hope, symbolized the future they were fighting for. Through her, they reminded the world that every step toward justice was an investment in the lives of those yet to come. Hope became a living testament to the belief that a better world was possible. A legacy in action. By the time Eleanor and Ethan entered their twilight years, the institutions they had built continued to thrive. The Jackson Center for Justice and Equity had grown into an international organization, influencing policies and fostering leaders worldwide. The People's Accountability Network became a standard model for police reform, replicated in dozens of countries. And the Bridge Initiative had transformed countless communities, creating spaces for healing and understanding. But perhaps the greatest testament to their legacy was the lives they touched, the young leaders they inspired, the families they helped heal, and the countless individuals who had found their voices through the movement. A quiet reflection. One evening, as Eleanor and Ethan sat together on their porch, surrounded by the laughter of their grandchildren, they reflected on their journey. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over their home, a sanctuary built on love and resilience. "I used to think justice was about fixing what's broken," Eleanor said softly, her hand resting on Ethan's. "But now I see it's about planting something new, something that can grow stronger with every generation." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We've done our part," he said. "Now it's up to them to carry it forward." A final lesson. As the world continued to evolve, the story of Eleanor and Ethan Jackson remained a guiding light. It reminded humanity that even in its darkest moments, there was always the potential for light, for transformation, and for hope. Their journey taught a simple but profound truth. Injustice thrives on silence, but justice grows louder when people stand together. And so, the Jacksons rested, knowing they had done their part to make the world a better place, not just for themselves, but for everyone. They left behind a legacy of courage, compassion, and unity. A reminder that the fight for justice, though difficult, is always worth it. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.